Welcome to my channel. Today's story is a journey of secrets, transformation, and a side of myself. A story of accidental discovery, hidden truths, and the long walk toward wholeness. I want to tell you something that took me the better part of a decade to say out loud. Not because I was ashamed, though I was, for a long time, but because I didn't fully understand it myself. And I think that's important to say at the start. I am not a person who had all the answers at the beginning of this story. I stumbled into most of what I know. I tripped over it in the dark, in a bathroom cabinet, on an ordinary Tuesday morning when I was running late for work and grabbed what I thought were my vitamins. I am going to tell you this story the way I lived it, imperfectly, honestly, and in the order it actually happened, because I think the mess of it is what makes it worth telling. If you're hoping for a clean arc where everything makes sense and the ending is a ribbon tied in a bow, I understand the appeal. But life rarely offers that. What it does offer, if you pay attention long enough, is something better than a clean arc. It offers understanding. And understanding, I've come to believe, is the thing we're all really looking for when we sit down with a story like this one. So let me go back to the beginning. Let me tell you about the man I was before any of this happened, because the man I was then is as much a part of this story as the man I became. My name is Daniel. I was born in a small city in the American Midwest, the second of 3 sons, in a family that could be described as functional without being particularly expressive. My father worked in logistics, which meant he was organized, practical, and not given to discussing feelings. My mother was a school teacher who loved books and kept a garden and believed deeply in the importance of being normal. I mean that without bitterness. She wasn't cruel about it. She just genuinely believed that normalcy was a form of safety, and she wanted her children to be safe. She had grown up in a generation where being different meant being a target, and so she raised us to fit. To blend. To move through the world without drawing the kind of attention that invites questions. I was good at that. Better than my brothers, actually. I was the child who wore the right clothes, said the right things, joined the right clubs. I played baseball not because I particularly loved it but because it was the kind of thing boys were supposed to do, and I was very good at being the kind of thing I was supposed to be. I had friends who were boys, I dated girls when the time came for that, I went to college and studied business administration because it was practical, and I graduated into a job that made reasonable use of my degree. I was, by every measurable standard, a man who had successfully fulfilled his social role. What I didn't know, or rather, what I knew but had spent 23 years carefully not knowing, was that there was a very different conversation happening underneath all of that. A quiet, persistent, strange undercurrent that I had learned to swim against so automatically that I barely noticed the effort anymore. I noticed things. I noticed the way fabric felt. I noticed the way certain colors looked in a room. I noticed the way women moved through spaces with what seemed to me like a kind of physical awareness that I envied without being able to name why. I noticed that when I watched films, I often found myself identifying more naturally with female characters, not in any romantic or sexual way, but in some deeper interior way that I couldn't explain. I noticed all of this and filed it under the category of things that were not worth examining, because examining them felt dangerous in a way I couldn't fully articulate. This is what people don't always understand about the kind of suppression I'm describing. It isn't always dramatic. There isn't always a traumatic incident or a moment of crisis. Sometimes it's just a very slow, very patient decision to not look at something. To keep your eyes slightly averted from a corner of yourself that feels risky. I had been doing this for so long by the time I was 27 that it required no conscious effort. It was just the shape of my life. And then I met Sarah. Sarah was a landscape architect. She had auburn hair and a quick, sardonic sense of humor, and she read 3 books a week, and she was the first person I had ever met who seemed genuinely uninterested in whether or not she was normal. She didn't perform normalcy or rebel against it. She just seemed to exist outside of it as a category entirely, as if the whole question of what people were supposed to be had simply never occurred to her as particularly relevant. She was who she was with a kind of calm that I found almost incomprehensibly attractive. We were married 4 years after we met, in a small outdoor ceremony at a botanical garden that she had partially designed. I wore a dark blue suit. She wore a dress the color of sage. My mother cried and told me afterward that Sarah was unusual, but in a good way, which was the closest my mother ever came to saying she liked someone she didn't quite understand. For the first several years of our marriage, we were happy. Not the performed happiness of people who are pretending, but the genuine, complicated, frequently imperfect happiness of two people who actually like each other and are genuinely trying. We argued about small things, the temperature of the apartment, whose turn it was to call the plumber, whether it was ever acceptable to use a speakerphone in a restaurant, and we agreed about the large things, which I've come to believe is the correct distribution. We traveled when we could. We built a home together in the way that doesn't mean a building but means a set of shared rhythms and private jokes and understood silences. What I didn't know, then, was that Sarah had her own version of the averted gaze. Her own corner she didn't look at directly. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the pills. It was a Thursday morning in March, 2 years ago now. I was running late because I had slept through my first alarm and the second one had been set for the wrong time, and I was doing that thing where you try to get ready in half the time without actually cutting anything out, which mostly just means you're doing everything faster and with less attention. I was standing at the bathroom sink with a glass of water in one hand, and I opened the cabinet above the sink, and I took out what I genuinely believed were my multivitamins. They were in a brown prescription bottle, which should have been my first clue that they were not multivitamins, but I was late and I was not paying the kind of attention that distinguishes between different brown prescription bottles. The label on my vitamins had worn off months ago. I had been meaning to replace the bottle, and this bottle was roughly the same size and shape. I shook out 2 capsules, swallowed them with my water, and left for work. I didn't think about it again that morning. I didn't think about it for several mornings after that. The bottle was there, I was late with some regularity, and I kept taking the pills. I think it went on for almost 3 weeks before anything made me look at the label, and even then it wasn't concern that made me look. It was idle curiosity on a Saturday when I wasn't in a hurry, picking up the bottle simply because it was in front of me, reading the label the way you read anything when your hands are occupied but your mind isn't quite. The label had Sarah's name on it. I read it slowly, the way you read something when your brain is simultaneously processing the words and recalculating several things at once. The medication name was long and unfamiliar. Beneath it was the dosage, twice daily, and beneath that was the prescribing doctor's name and the pharmacy address, and I put the bottle down and stood there for a moment with a feeling that I can best describe as the sensation of the floor having moved slightly without actually moving. I looked up the medication on my phone. It took me less than 30 seconds to understand what I had been taking. Estrogen. A low-dose hormone supplement. Prescribed, the label said, for the management of symptoms. I stood in the bathroom for what I think was about 4 minutes, reading and rereading the Wikipedia page and a couple of medical reference pages, as if reading them more times would change what they said. Then I put my phone back in my pocket and went to make coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking at the backyard and thought, with a curious detachment, that I needed to tell Sarah what had happened. But then I didn't. Not that morning. Not because I was hiding anything, at least not at that point. Mostly because Sarah was out with a friend and by the time she came home the moment had passed from the category of urgent news into something I kept intending to bring up and kept not quite bringing up. I told myself I would mention it at dinner. I told myself I would tell her before bed. I did neither. The day became 2 days, and 2 days became a week, and the week became the whole of the reason I'm sitting here telling you this story. Because something was happening. Slowly. Subtly. The way that things that will eventually become important always seem to begin quietly, incrementally, wearing the costume of the ordinary. I noticed it first in my skin. This sounds strange and clinical when I say it this way, but it's the most accurate description. My skin began to feel different. Softer, in a way that wasn't dramatic, but was unmistakable to my own touch. I noticed it washing my hands, and then I noticed it more obviously on my face, which seemed to have taken on a slightly different quality, less rough, less lined in the small habitual ways that I was used to. It wasn't the kind of change anyone else would have flagged immediately. But I knew my own face the way you know something you've looked at in mirrors for 31 years, and something was different. There were other things. My moods shifted in ways I wasn't entirely accustomed to. I felt things with more immediacy somehow, as if the usual layer of insulation I carried between myself and my emotional responses had thinned slightly. I cried at a commercial once, genuinely and unexpectedly, and sat with that for a while afterward, not in distress exactly, but in a kind of curious observation of myself. I felt more tired at certain points of the day and more energized at others than my usual rhythms would have predicted. I felt, occasionally, a kind of warmth in my chest that didn't have a clear source, not happiness exactly, but something adjacent to it, a quiet, wordless contentment that seemed to have no particular object. I want to be careful here about how I'm describing this, because I know it's easy for this kind of narrative to slide into oversimplification, into the idea that hormones are destiny or that physical changes automatically produce certain internal experiences. That is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that something was shifting, and that the shift was opening a door inside me that I had been very skilled at keeping closed, and that what came through the door was not the hormones themselves, but the conversation that had been waiting behind them. The conversation I had been not having with myself for most of my adult life. The clothes came later. And again, I want to be precise about this, because the way it happened matters. It wasn't a compulsion. It wasn't a sudden uncontrollable urge. It wasn't erotic or theatrical or dramatic in the way that stories about crossdressing often present it. It happened the way most significant things happen, gradually, almost logically, as the natural continuation of something that was already in motion. Sarah had gone to visit her sister for a long weekend, which she did twice a year. I was alone in the house, which I was used to and had never found particularly remarkable. That Friday evening I was doing laundry, and I was carrying a load of clothes from the bedroom to the laundry room, and some of Sarah's things were in the pile, a soft cardigan, a pair of loose linen trousers that she wore on weekends, and I was walking past the bathroom mirror when I stopped. I stood there for a long moment. The cardigan was draped over my arm. I looked at it, and then at myself in the mirror, and then back at the cardigan. And something that had been building for weeks, probably longer than weeks, probably for most of my life if I was being honest about it, asked a very simple, very quiet question. What would that feel like? Not as a challenge. Not as a transgression. Not as anything dramatic. Just as a question. An honest, curious, private question between me and myself, standing in a hallway on a Friday night with no audience and no stakes and no one's expectations to manage. I put the cardigan on. And I stood in front of the mirror. And I looked at myself. What I felt was not what I expected, which is to say that I had expected to feel something extreme, either thrilling or shameful or both, and instead what I felt was very quiet and very still. A kind of recognition. Like hearing a piece of music you've never heard before but which sounds immediately like something you've always known. I kept waiting for the feeling to become something louder, something more dramatic that would explain itself more clearly, but it stayed exactly what it was, quiet, still, recognizing. I stood there for about 10 minutes. I took the cardigan off and folded it carefully and put it back. I finished the laundry and made dinner and watched television and went to bed. And I lay in the dark for a long time thinking about that 10 minutes with a concentration and seriousness that I hadn't brought to most of the other events of that week. I tried it again the next evening. This time the linen trousers as well. I sat at the kitchen table in Sarah's clothes and drank a cup of tea and read 20 pages of a novel I'd been meaning to finish for a month, and it was perhaps the most ordinary, unremarkable sequence of events imaginable, and yet underneath it was a quality of presence. A feeling of being more fully located in myself, that I was not accustomed to and could not quite explain. I am aware that this is the part of the story that some people will find difficult to understand, or will want to assign meanings to that I'm not intending. I want to address that directly, because I think the confusion around this is important to acknowledge. What I experienced in those moments was not about wanting to be a woman in any simple declarative sense. It was not about dissatisfaction with my body or with my life. It was not about sexuality. It was about something far less dramatic and far more interesting, a kind of inner spaciousness that I had not known was available to me. A way of inhabiting myself that was less performed and more simply present. I have talked to therapists about this since, and I have read a great deal, and I have come to understand that the relationship between clothing and identity is genuinely complex and genuinely important and genuinely not something that most of us in Western culture are given good tools for thinking about. We are taught, very early and very thoroughly, that clothing is gender and gender is binary and anything outside of the expected assignment is a category error to be corrected or concealed. What we are not taught is that clothing is also self-expression, and that self-expression is one of the fundamental human needs, and that when you have spent most of your life expressing a version of yourself that is carefully curated for social acceptability, encountering a different mode of expression can feel not like transgression but like relief. That is the word I kept coming back to, in those weeks that followed. Relief. Not excitement. Not defiance. Relief. The sensation of having put something down that you didn't know you were carrying. But relief is not the same as ease, and I want to be clear about that too, because what happened alongside that relief was a significant and sustained period of internal conflict that I would not want to minimize. Because what I was experiencing privately was happening alongside a life that I had not yet reconsidered. A marriage. A professional identity. A set of friendships and family relationships and social expectations that were all predicated on a version of me that I had been performing so long it had become invisible even to me. And the question that began to press itself against all of that, quietly and insistently, was, what do I do with this? I did not, I want to say clearly, handle this question well at first. My first instinct was the instinct I had been practicing my entire life, which was to put it back. To close the door. To decide that this was a strange interlude caused by the accidental hormones and that when their effects faded, this particular inner weather would clear and I would return to my previous equilibrium. I found this narrative deeply comforting for several weeks and I defended it against my own experience with considerable energy. Every time I felt the pull of that inner spaciousness, I reminded myself that it was chemical, that it was temporary, that it did not represent anything real about who I was. The problem with this strategy was that it required me to define real in a way that kept becoming more and more strained. Because the feelings were real. The recognition was real. The relief was real. These things were happening inside my actual lived experience, which is generally the standard by which we determine whether something is real, and telling myself that they were merely the side effect of a medication began to feel less like prudence and more like a particularly sophisticated form of lying to myself. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes from keeping a secret from yourself. It is different from the loneliness of keeping a secret from other people, though that loneliness is also real. What I'm describing is the loneliness of the internal argument, the constant low-level expenditure of energy required to maintain a position about yourself that your own experience keeps failing to confirm. I had been doing a version of this for years, the long practice of not looking at the corner, but it had never been quite this loud, quite this present, quite this unavoidable before. The accident of the pills had turned up the volume on something that had always been playing, and I could no longer pretend I couldn't hear it. Meanwhile, the physical changes were still there. Still subtle, still not the kind of thing that announced itself dramatically to people who saw me daily, but present in ways that I was acutely aware of. My body was softer in certain places. My emotional responses were closer to the surface. There were moments of physical sensitivity that were new and unfamiliar. I had stopped taking the pills by then, I had found my actual vitamins, separately labeled, on a different shelf, and I had put Sarah's prescription back, but the changes didn't reverse immediately, and in some ways they've never entirely reversed, which I'll come back to. I want to tell you about the morning I came close to confessing. Because I think it illustrates something important about the nature of fear and how it operates in relationships. It was a Sunday. Sarah and I had had a slow morning, coffee in bed, the particular comfortable silence of two people who have learned to be quiet together without it meaning anything is wrong. We were reading, and I had been thinking for about 40 minutes about whether to tell her, running the conversation through my head, imagining her reactions, trying to find the version of the opening that felt both honest and survivable. I had it almost ready. I was on the verge. And then she looked up from her book and said, with the slightly distracted air of someone following a thought, "You seem different lately." In a good way. More relaxed somehow. I looked at her. She was already looking back at her book. She didn't mean it as an inquiry. She meant it as an observation, the way you might observe that the light is nicer in the morning than it used to be. And I sat there with my almost confession fully loaded and nowhere to go, and I said, "Do I? That's interesting." And she said, and turned a page, and the moment passed. What I felt in the aftermath of that almost confession was complicated. There was relief, again, the relief of having not been required to speak. But underneath the relief was something heavier, the awareness that I had just made a choice. That I had been presented with an opening and I had let it close. And the question of why I had let it close, why the prospect of honesty with someone I loved and trusted had felt more dangerous than the loneliness of carrying this alone, was a question that I wasn't yet ready to sit with fully. I did sit with it, eventually. That's the thing about questions you're not ready for, they don't go away. They just wait, with a patience that is almost terrible, until you are. The waiting period, the months between the initial discovery and the conversation that finally changed everything, was the hardest and also, in retrospect, the most important period of this story. Because it was during this time that I was forced to actually think. Not to react, not to manage, but to genuinely and carefully and honestly think about who I was and what I wanted and what I was actually afraid of. I started writing. Not with any intention of sharing what I wrote, but just as a practice of externalizing what was happening internally, because what was happening internally had become too complex and too fast-moving to track any other way. I wrote about the relief and the confusion. I wrote about the version of myself I had been presenting for 31 years and whether that version was a lie or just an incomplete truth. I wrote about what I was afraid my wife would think, and about what I was afraid my friends would think, and about what I was afraid I myself would have to admit if I looked at this too directly. I wrote about my father and the way he had of making masculinity feel like a test that you were always in some danger of failing. I wrote about the specific texture of the Saturday nights when Sarah was away and I had been alone in the house and how they had felt different from any other time I had been alone, more inhabited somehow, more quiet in the right ways. I wrote a lot about fear. Because fear, I was discovering, was the connective tissue of all of this. Not the fear of discovery, though that was present, but a deeper and more shapeless fear that I came to think of as the fear of becoming. The fear that if I looked too honestly at what I was experiencing, I would find something that required me to change. Not just to change my behavior or my habits, but to change my understanding of myself at a foundational level. And changing your understanding of yourself at a foundational level is genuinely frightening, even when the change is towards something better, because it means letting go of the familiar, even the familiar that has been limiting you. I think this is something that doesn't get enough attention in the public conversation about identity and self-discovery. We tend to celebrate the arrival, the person who has accepted themselves, the relationship that has survived honesty, the community that has been found on the other side of the long journey. What we talk about less is the middle, the stretch of time that is all journey and no arrival, when you can see that you have left one understanding of yourself but cannot yet see the next one clearly. That middle is where most of the work happens. That middle is where you decide what kind of person you are going to be, not in terms of gender expression or sexuality or any of the categories we reach for, but in terms of courage. In terms of whether you are going to be a person who tells the truth about their experience or a person who doesn't. I decided, slowly and not without resistance, that I was going to try to be the former. But before I could tell Sarah, something happened that took the choice out of my hands. It was a Tuesday evening in late October, about 7 months after the pill incident. I had been home for about an hour, and I'm going to be straightforward about this, been wearing a blouse of Sarah's that I'd found in a bag of clothes she had set aside to donate to charity. I had asked her about the bag, whether she was done with everything in it, and she had said yes, and so technically I was not doing anything furtive. But I was certainly doing something I hadn't told her about. I was wearing the blouse over my own jeans and I was cooking dinner and I had the radio on and it was one of those evenings that felt very peaceful, very quiet, very much like a life I could inhabit. And then Sarah came home early. Not dramatically, not throwing open a door. She just came home 40 minutes earlier than I expected because her meeting had been cancelled, and she set her bag down in the entry and called my name in the ordinary way, and I said her name back in a voice I recognized immediately as the voice of someone who was trying not to sound like they'd been doing something unusual. I did not run to the bedroom and change. Partly because there wasn't time, and partly, this matters, because something in me had made a decision in that half second between her voice in the entry and my voice in response that I was not entirely conscious of making at the time. I turned from the stove as she came into the kitchen. She stopped. She looked at me. I looked at her. There was a pause that was probably 4 seconds long and felt considerably longer. I waited. I was waiting for the reaction I had been dreading for months, the confusion, the hurt, the demand for an explanation. I had rehearsed the explanation so many times that I knew it by heart. I was ready to give it, or at least to attempt it. My heart was going very fast and my face was very warm. What I was not ready for was what actually happened. What Sarah did was look at me for those 4 seconds, and then she looked at the blouse. It was a soft coral color, something she'd had for years, and then she looked back at my face, and she set her keys on the counter very deliberately, and she said, in a voice that was careful and calm and somehow not at all surprised, "We should probably talk." And she sat down at the kitchen table. And I sat across from her. And what followed was 2.5 hours of conversation that I would describe as the most important conversation I have ever had in my life. I started, because she seemed to be waiting for me to start, and I told her everything. Not in the rehearsed version, not in the carefully constructed explanation I had prepared and revised over months. In the actual version, which was messier and more uncertain and involved more pauses and more redirections and more moments of me stopping mid-sentence because I'd arrived somewhere I didn't quite have language for yet. I told her about the pills, which I should have told her in March, and about the physical changes, and about the way the changes had seemed to correspond with something already in me rather than creating something new. I told her about the Saturday nights when she was away. I told her about the journal. I told her about the fear. She listened. She did not interrupt. She asked 2 or 3 questions at points where she needed more information, and the questions were careful and specific and not unkind. When I finally ran out of things to say, when I'd reached the end of the actual story and was sitting there feeling both lighter and more exposed than I had perhaps ever felt in my adult life, she was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I have something to tell you too." The things Sarah told me had been sitting in her for longer than my story had been sitting in me. Years longer. A decade, by her account. She had known since she was in her 20s, or suspected and then known with a certainty that she had spent 10 years trying to figure out what to do with, which is a long time to carry something alone. She told me that she was not cisgender. That she had understood herself, for a long time, to exist outside of the neat categories she had been assigned, though not in a way that required dramatic external change so much as a quiet internal acknowledgement of a more complex reality than the surface suggested. She had been seeing a therapist for 3 years. She had told her sister. She had been building up, carefully and methodically, the internal architecture of a conversation she intended to have with me, and had not yet found the right moment to begin. The hormone supplements, she told me, were the early stages of a protocol she had discussed with her doctor. Low dose, exploratory, not definitive, a way of understanding her own body's relationship to something she was still in the process of understanding herself. We sat at that kitchen table for the better part of the evening. The dinner I had been making went cold on the stove. At some point Sarah got up and made tea and we held the mugs more than we drank from them, and outside the window it got dark and the conversation moved through a dozen different rooms of both our lives. Through the years before we met each other and the years after. Through the things we had not said and the reasons we had not said them. Through the fear on both sides, and there was substantial fear on both sides, and through the underneath of the fear, which in both cases turned out to be the same thing, the terror that love, which had come to feel like the most stable thing in a complicated life, might not be able to hold the full weight of who we actually were. I am going to sit with that for a moment before I go on, because I think it's something worth sitting with. The terror that love might not be able to hold the full weight of who we actually were. I think this is one of the central fears of adult life, and I think it is almost never spoken about directly. We talk about honesty in relationships as if it is a simple virtue, a clean and obvious right action, as if the only obstacle to it is cowardice or selfishness. What we talk about less is the reasonable and deeply human fear that the people who love us love a curated version of us, and that if we let them see the uncurated version, they may love it less. This is not paranoia. This is the recognition that we are social beings who have learned, through long experience, that approval is conditional. That belonging is conditional. That the safety of being known depends on being known in the right ways. And so we cure it. We manage our presentations. We emphasize the acceptable parts and de-emphasize the rest, not because we are deceitful but because we are afraid. And the curation, over years, creates a distance between the self we present and the self we actually experience that can become its own particular kind of suffering, the suffering of being unknown, of being loved for a representation rather than for the thing itself. What Sarah and I discovered that evening, over cold dinner and warm tea and 2 hours of the most honest conversation we had ever had, was that we had both been doing this. Both of us. Separately and without each other's knowledge, we had each been managing a version of ourselves for the other's consumption, and the management had cost us both something we hadn't fully been able to name before that night. What it had cost us was intimacy. Not warmth, we had plenty of warmth. Not comfort, we had built a genuinely comfortable life together. But the specific intimacy that comes from being seen completely, from having the uncurated version of yourself witnessed and received and not found wanting, that we had not had. And I had not known I was missing it until the moment we began to approach it, at which point the recognition was so sudden and so overwhelming that I had to stop talking for a minute to let myself feel it properly. I want to describe what the weeks after that conversation were like, because they were not simple, and I think the unsimplicity of them is part of the truth of this story. A significant conversation of the kind Sarah and I had does not resolve anything cleanly. It opens things. It clears away the scaffolding that has been holding a particular shape in place, and the shape that emerges from underneath is not a finished thing. It is a beginning. We had questions. A great many questions. About identity and about marriage and about how two people navigate the territory of the deeply personal when that territory turns out to be more complex than either of them had previously understood. We had questions that neither of us could answer for the other, and questions that required outside help, and questions that turned out, upon examination, to be better than the answers they were pointing toward because the questions were the thing that was keeping us in honest conversation. We went to couples therapy. I want to be direct about this because I think there is still a stigma around it that prevents people from treating it as the entirely reasonable and useful tool that it is. We saw a therapist who specialized in identity and gender and relationships, a pragmatic and thoughtful person who had, clearly, heard many versions of this kind of story, and who met ours without any of the drama or alarm that I had half expected and been quietly dreading. She helped us find language for things we had been experiencing but couldn't name, and language matters enormously when you are trying to navigate new territory, because without it you are doing everything in the dark. I want to tell you what I was learning during this period, because the learning is the point of this story more than any of the events. I was learning that identity is not a fixed point. This seems obvious when you say it, and yet the degree to which we are trained to treat it as fixed is remarkable. We are given a set of categories at birth: sex, nationality, family name, family religion, and as we grow, we are given more: profession, class, relationship status, political affiliation, gender expression. And the implicit instruction that accompanies all of these categories is that they are permanent. That who you are is who you will continue to be. That the self is a settled thing. What I was discovering, at 31, was that the self is not a settled thing. It is a process. It is something that moves and changes and surprises you, if you are paying attention. And the movement and change are not signs of instability or error. They are signs of life. A self that never changes, never surprises, never encounters itself in unexpected ways, is not a particularly vivid or alive self. It is a self that has learned to be very still, which is a different thing. I was also learning that the conversation we in modern culture have about gender and identity, the public conversation, the one that happens in media and politics and social media, is often so polarized and so loud that it makes it very difficult to hear the quieter, more private conversation that most individuals are actually having. The public conversation tends to present identity as a set of claims, a set of positions to be defended or attacked. The private conversation, at least in my experience, is much more tentative, much more exploratory, much more characterized by questions than by declarations. Most people I have spoken with who have navigated some form of identity exploration describe it not as a revelation but as a gradual clarification, not a moment when they suddenly knew who they were, but a slow accumulation of honesty about who they were not. I am not a woman. I need to say that clearly, because I think clarity is important and I don't want to leave things ambiguous in ways that create confusion. But I am also not the version of a man that I had been performing for 31 years, and the distance between that version and whatever the more honest version is turned out to be larger and more significant than I had understood. The version I had been performing was, I came to see, less about who I was and more about what I thought was expected of me, and that is a subtle but critical distinction. Because when you live inside a performance for long enough, you can lose track of the difference between the performance and the performer. What I found, on the other side of that tracking, was a person who was softer in temperament than I had been performing. A person for whom emotional responsiveness was not a weakness to be managed but an actual capacity to be employed. A person who had aesthetic sensibilities and domestic pleasures and ways of inhabiting a space that did not fit neatly into the cultural template of masculinity I had been given. A person who had been, in some sense, asking to be allowed to be more fully themselves for a very long time, and who had kept not quite being given permission. The question of who gives permission for this kind of thing, who has the authority to tell you that you are allowed to be more fully yourself, is one I keep coming back to. Because the honest answer is that nobody gives it to you. You give it to yourself. And the reason that's hard, and the reason that so many people spend so long waiting for permission that never comes, is that we have been taught to derive our sense of what we're allowed to be from external sources. From parents, from peers, from the culture at large. The idea that we might be the primary authority on our own experience, that the permission is ours to give, can feel both liberating and terrifying, because it comes with responsibility. It means you can't wait anymore. It means the decision is yours. I gave myself permission, incrementally, over the course of the year that followed. I'm not describing this as a dramatic transformation. There was no single moment of declaration. It happened the way most real changes happen, in small adjustments, in the gradual normalization of things that had previously felt impossible, in the accumulation of ordinary moments in which I was slightly more honest than I had been before. I changed the way I dressed, modestly, in ways that most people probably didn't notice but that I felt clearly and that mattered to me. I bought a few things of my own, softer fabrics, a wider color range, things that didn't advertise themselves but that fit me differently from the inside than the clothes I had been wearing for 30 years. I stopped suppressing emotional responses in conversations where suppressing them was costing me connection. I stopped performing the certain, detached version of competence that I had used for years as my default professional register and discovered that the more genuine version, which was sometimes less certain and sometimes more curious, was actually more effective in most of the situations where I'd been using the performance. These are not enormous changes. I want to be honest about that too. This is not a story about a radical external transformation. The story of my life to an outside observer looks largely the same as it did before. I work. I am married. I have a home. I have friends. What is different is internal, the quality of presence I bring to all of those things, the degree to which the person showing up to them is the actual person rather than a managed representative. And that difference, while invisible from outside, is the whole world from inside. Sarah and I rebuilt something during that year. Or perhaps more accurately, we built something we had never quite had. Because the marriage we had before that October evening was a good one by most measures, but it was a marriage between two people who were each withholding a piece of themselves, and a marriage between two people who are each withholding a piece of themselves is, in a very precise sense, a marriage between four people, the two actual selves and the two presentations. Getting to a marriage that was between the actual selves required dismantling some of what we had built on the false foundation, which was uncomfortable and sometimes frightening, and then building something new on the true one, which was slower and more careful but enormously more solid. I want to tell you something about what that building looked like, because I think it might be useful. It looked, most of the time, like conversation. Specifically, it looked like the kind of conversation where you say the thing you are actually thinking instead of the thing you have edited it down to because the original version feels too risky. It looked like Sarah telling me things about her experience of her own body and her own identity that she had never told anyone except her therapist, and me listening without trying to fix or categorize or understand faster than was honest. It looked like me telling her things about the long history of suppression that I had spent decades not examining, and her listening with a patience and a care that I had not known she had in that particular way, or perhaps had not known how to receive before. It looked like disagreement. Real disagreement, about real things, including things that were genuinely hard, about what our future looked like, about what changes either of us needed to make and how fast, about the difference between accommodation and genuine understanding, about the ways in which even well-intentioned people can fail to give each other what they need because they don't yet know what that is. We disagreed and we stayed in the room and we came back the next day and tried again, and this, the staying in the room, the coming back, was, I think, the actual architecture of the thing we were building. It looked like vulnerability, which is a word I used to find somewhat cliched but which I now think is one of the most precisely useful words in the emotional vocabulary. Vulnerability is not weakness. Vulnerability is the willingness to be visible without guarantee of outcome, and in a culture that constantly encourages us to manage our presentation for maximum safety, it is a remarkably courageous act. Sarah was vulnerable with me, and I was vulnerable with her, and the experience of being mutually vulnerable, genuinely, not performatively, created a closeness that I don't think we had ever quite had before. I want to talk about the people around us, because that is also part of this story. Because this story did not happen in isolation. It happened inside a network of relationships and expectations and assumptions that were affected by what we were going through, even when those relationships didn't know the specifics. My parents did not know. My brothers did not know. Most of our friends did not know. Sarah's sister knew, because Sarah had told her years ago, and her sister's response had been the kind of uncomplicated love and practical support that you hope for and don't always get. But outside of that, and outside of our therapists, we were navigating this relatively privately, which was a choice we made deliberately and which I think was the right choice for us, even though the privacy had its own particular kind of weight. I did tell one friend. A man I've known since graduate school, a quietly thoughtful person named Marcus who had himself navigated a divorce and a professional reinvention in the space of 2 years and who had emerged from that period with the particular hard-won equanimity of someone who has been through the furnace and come out the other side with a new understanding of what is and isn't worth holding on to. I told Marcus about most of it, not every detail, but the substance, and his response was to sit with it for a moment and then say, with characteristic directness, that sounds like a lot to have been carrying by yourself. Not a question, not a judgment. Just a recognition. And that recognition, simple as it was, meant more to me than I expected it to. I am aware that other people's stories go differently. I am aware that many people who undertake this kind of internal exploration encounter not understanding but rejection. Not support but condemnation. I am aware that my experience of being largely received with care and patience is not universal, and I do not want to imply that the outcome is guaranteed or that the process is without real cost. For many people, the cost is enormous. Relationships end. Families fracture. Livelihoods are threatened. The social consequences of being seen as transgressing gender norms can be serious and lasting, and the people who face those consequences are not dramatic or reckless. They are people who told the truth about who they were and discovered that the world they were living in had contingencies they hadn't known about. What I want to say to those people, and to anyone who is in the middle of a version of this journey right now, is something that I don't think gets said often enough or clearly enough. The work of becoming more honest with yourself is worth doing even when the external conditions are difficult. Not because the honesty will necessarily make things easier in the short term, it often won't, but because the alternative, the long maintenance of the averted gaze, has its own accumulated cost that is less visible but no less real. The cost is the life you didn't live. The self you didn't let be known. The relationships that remained at a certain depth because you never brought them deeper. These are not trivial costs. They are, in some cases, the cost of a life. I don't say that to be dramatic. I say it because I spent 31 years paying it, and I didn't know I was paying it until I stopped. There is something I want to say about the body, because I have been circling it throughout this story and I think it deserves more direct attention. The physical changes that began with the accidental hormones did diminish over time, as one would expect. My skin went back to more or less what it had been. The immediate heightening of emotional responsiveness settled into a new but less acute equilibrium. What did not entirely go away, and what I have come to think of as a kind of gift that the accident gave me, was a different relationship to my own physical experience. An awareness of my body as something I inhabited rather than something I operated. A willingness to attend to what my body was telling me with more patience and more interest than I had previously brought. I had, before all of this, been somewhat dissociated from my physical experience in the way that I think many people who have spent years in a kind of mild but persistent self-suppression become dissociated. Not dramatically, not in a clinical way, just in the ordinary way where the body becomes largely a logistics problem to be managed, kept fed, kept exercised, kept presentable, rather than something that carries its own information and its own wisdom. The experiences of those weeks, and everything that came after them, returned me to a more present relationship with my own physical existence, and this has been, practically speaking, one of the most useful changes in my life. I sleep better. I eat with more attention. I am less likely to ignore physical signals that are trying to tell me something. I am, simply, more here. I am also a better husband. I say this not as a claim of virtue but as an observation about what happens when two people in a marriage are actually present with each other instead of with the managed versions of each other they have been maintaining. Sarah and I communicate with more directness and more patience than we did before. We have disagreements that get resolved rather than avoided. We have pleasures that are genuinely shared rather than performed for mutual approval. We have, in a word, a more real relationship, and the more real relationship is more demanding in some ways, but infinitely more nourishing. I want to come back to the question I started with, which is the question of who I am. Because I have been building toward it throughout this story, and I think it is time to address it as directly as I can. Who I am is a person who was given a set of instructions at birth about how to be a man, and who followed those instructions with considerable diligence for 30 years, and who discovered, through an accident, through a small bottle in a bathroom cabinet, through the strange grace of stumbling into something he wasn't looking for, that he had been, without quite knowing it, living at a slight remove from himself. That the instructions had been useful in many ways, but had also been a constraint. That within the constraint there had been a fuller person quietly waiting to take up more space. Who I am is a person who wears, sometimes, clothes that are technically categorized as women's clothing, not because I am confused about my gender identity but because I have stopped outsourcing my sense of what I'm allowed to wear to a system of cultural rules that were never particularly concerned with my comfort or my truth. I wear what makes me feel present. I wear what makes me feel like myself, and the self I feel like does not reliably map onto the clothing section I was assigned at birth. Who I am is a husband who almost lost the most important relationship in his life by choosing silence, and who was given, improbably and without deserving it, a second chance to choose honesty. And who took that chance, badly and late and with a great deal of stumbling, and found that honesty, even badly and late and stumbling, is almost always preferable to the alternative. Who I am is someone who is still in the middle of figuring it out. Because the truth is that identity is not a destination. It is not the place you arrive at after the journey. It is the journey itself, the continuous, imperfect, sometimes bewildering and sometimes illuminating process of being honest about your experience and then being honest about the next experience, and then the one after that. It doesn't end. And I have come to think that the ending of it would be a kind of death, not a completion. I want to say something about the concept of the accident, because I've been thinking about it throughout the telling of this story and I find it genuinely interesting. An accident is, by definition, something that was not intended. Something that happened outside the plan. And we tend to treat accidents, especially when they are uncomfortable ones, as problems to be corrected, deviations from the intended path that need to be reversed as quickly and completely as possible. The rational response to taking the wrong medication is to stop taking it and possibly see a doctor and move on. The rational response to feeling things you didn't expect to feel is to wait for them to pass and then get back to your regular life. But sometimes the accident shows you something that the plan was never going to show you. Sometimes the deviation is where the actual information is. Sometimes the wrong pill is what opens the right door. I am not recommending accidental hormone ingestion as a path to self-knowledge. I am saying that the accident gave me a permission I hadn't given myself, and that within that permission was something real and significant that I don't think I would have found through the planned routes. The planned routes were all headed somewhere else. There is a philosophical tradition, which I came across in the reading I was doing during the months of quiet self-examination, that speaks about the idea of the felix culpa, the fortunate fault, the happy accident, the mistake that turns out to have been necessary. I am not trying to mystify what happened to me or to suggest that it was fated or cosmically ordained. I don't think that. I think it was genuinely accidental. But I also think that what we do with accidents, whether we treat them as problems to be corrected or as information to be examined, is one of the most revealing things about the kind of person we are and the kind of life we are building. I chose, eventually, to examine it. Not immediately, not without resistance, not without the long middle period of confusion and fear and avoidance that I've described. But eventually, yes. I chose to take the accident seriously. And taking it seriously led me to myself, to a more complete, more honest, more inhabitable version of myself than the one I had been occupying for the previous 3 decades. Sarah, too, found in the conversation that the accident triggered the space to take her own truth seriously in a new way. Her process is her own, and it is not mine to narrate in detail, but I will say that the year after our October evening conversation was a year of significant, courageous movement for her, movement toward a fuller expression of who she is, toward the kind of life that fits the person she actually is rather than the person she had been making herself fit. That movement required support, and I tried to offer it as honestly and fully as I could, which was not always perfectly but was always with intention. We are, as I sit here and speak to you, in a better place than we have ever been. That is not a clean or triumphant statement. A better place includes things that are still difficult and questions that are still open and adjustments that are still in process. A better place means we are building something that is genuinely ours, not the relationship we were supposed to have, not the relationship other people expected us to have, but the actual relationship between the actual people we are, which is stranger and richer and less predictable than anything the plan had suggested. I think about the man I was before that Thursday morning in March. The man who took 2 pills from the wrong bottle and rushed out the door without reading the label. I think about him with affection, and also with a kind of compassion that I couldn't have felt from inside the experience, because compassion for your past self requires a little distance and a certain kind of hindsight. He was doing his best. He had been trained well in the things he had been trained in. He had learned to be safe in the ways he had learned to be safe, and those ways had cost him things he didn't know he was paying for. I would not tell him to do anything differently. Not because the process didn't hurt, it did, but because I think the process was the only path to where we are. I think I needed the accident. I think I needed the weeks of confusion, and the fear, and the almost confessions that I didn't give, and the journal, and eventually the kitchen and the blouse and Sarah's face looking at me with 4 seconds of careful calm before she sat down and changed everything. I needed all of it. And having needed it, and having lived through it, and having arrived on the other side of it into something that feels more honest and more real than anything that came before, I am grateful for it. Not for the fear, exactly, and not for the loneliness, and not for the long years of the averted gaze. But for what they opened into. For the conversation that followed. For the marriage that we have now. For the man I am now, which is simply a man who has agreed to be more fully present in his own life. That, in the end, is all any of this was ever about. Not categories or labels or the complicated cultural politics of gender expression. Those things are real and they matter and they are worth understanding. But underneath them, for me, the whole story was about presence. About whether I was going to be fully here, in my own experience, in my own body, in my own marriage, in my own life, or whether I was going to continue to hover a careful distance above it, managing and curating and presenting, giving everyone around me and also myself the performance of a person rather than the person. I chose the person. Badly and late and with a lot of help I didn't deserve as early as I needed it. But I chose the person. And I am here to tell you that the person, uncurated and fully arrived, is a considerably better place to live.